I'll create part 1 in a separate document with approximately 1,400 words, using simple English and a natural, human-centric tone. The grand concert hall buzzed with excitement as people found their seats. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the red velvet chairs. Men in suits and women in elegant dresses filled the hall, their voices creating a soft hum of conversation. Tonight was special. Viktor Petrov, one of the most famous pianists in the world, would perform at the prestigious Lincoln Center in New York City. Outside, a line of limousines dropped off important guests. Music critics from major newspapers clutched their notepads. Wealthy art patrons greeted each other with air kisses. Students from the nearby music school stood in the back, having bought the cheapest tickets they could afford. Everyone wanted to witness Viktor's magic. Behind the stage, Viktor paced in his dressing room. He was a tall man in his mid-40s with salt and pepper hair that he kept perfectly styled. His concert suit was custom-made in Italy, and his shoes shone like mirrors. He flexed his long fingers, each movement precise and controlled. These hands had earned him millions of dollars in worldwide fame. 10 minutes, Mr. Petrov, called the stage manager through the door. Viktor didn't respond. He never did. The staff knew better than to expect acknowledgement from the great maestro before a performance. His reputation for brilliance was matched only by his reputation for arrogance. "Is everything to your liking?" asked Thomas, Viktor's personal assistant, a nervous young man who had worked for him for 3 years, longer than any previous assistant had lasted. "The piano was tuned again?" Viktor asked, his Russian accent still noticeable despite his years in America. "Yes, sir. Twice today, just as you requested." "And the temperature of the hall?" "Exactly 71 degrees as you specified." Viktor nodded slightly. He demanded perfection in every detail. The temperature had to be just right for his fingers to move with ideal flexibility. The lighting had to hit the stage at the correct angle. Even the flowers in his dressing room were specifically white lilies. No other flower was acceptable. "The crowd tonight?" Viktor asked, adjusting his cufflinks. "Full house, sold out months ago. The director of the Philharmonic is here, 3 critics from major papers, and—" Thomas hesitated. "What?" Viktor snapped. "Your former teacher, Professor Liu, is in the audience." Viktor paused mid-motion. Professor Liu had taught him at the Moscow Conservatory 30 years ago. The old man had been brutally honest about Viktor's playing, often reducing the young prodigy to tears. Yet it was Professor Liu who had shaped him into the musician he was today. "Box seat?" Viktor asked. "No, orchestra level. 5th row center." A small smile played at the corner of Viktor's mouth. "Perfect." The old man would have an excellent view of his former student's mastery. The 5-minute call came, and Viktor took a deep breath. He had performed this routine hundreds of times. First, he would stand silently for exactly 60 seconds, eyes closed, visualizing the music. Then he would roll his shoulders 3 times, crack his knuckles, though every piano teacher advised against this, and finally take a sip of room-temperature water with a squeeze of lemon. Tonight's program was ambitious. Bach, Beethoven, and Rachmaninoff. The kind of program that would leave lesser pianists with cramped hands and exhausted minds. But Viktor wasn't a lesser pianist. He was, as the New York Times had called him, a force of nature at the keyboard. The stage manager knocked again. "We're ready for you, Mr. Petrov." Viktor nodded to Thomas, who opened the door. The narrow hallway to the stage was lined with photographs of legendary performers who had played at this venue: Vladimir Horowitz, Arthur Rubinstein, Glenn Gould. Viktor walked past them without a glance. In his mind, he had already surpassed them all. As he approached the stage, he could hear the audience quieting down in anticipation. The darkness beyond the curtain held thousands of people waiting to be moved, impressed, perhaps even changed by his performance. This was the moment he lived for. The announcer's voice boomed through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, Lincoln Center is proud to present the world-renowned pianist Viktor Petrov." The audience erupted in applause as Viktor walked onto the stage. The spotlight followed him as he moved with practiced grace toward the magnificent grand piano that waited center stage. He paused before the audience, giving a slight bow, not too deep, just enough to acknowledge their presence without suggesting they were his equals. The applause continued as he took his seat, adjusting the bench to his precise liking. Viktor stared at the keys for a moment, gathering himself. Then he looked up and surveyed the crowd with cool confidence. His eyes found Professor Liu, who sat with perfect posture, hands folded in his lap, expression unreadable. Victor began with Bach's Italian Concerto. His fingers danced across the keys with technical perfection. Each note was crystal clear, each phrase shaped with mathematical precision. The audience sat entranced as the music filled every corner of the hall. From Bach, he moved to Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata. Here, Victor unleashed more emotion, his body swaying slightly as his hands thundered through the dramatic passages. The concert hall seemed to hold its collective breath during the quiet moments, then gasped at the furious crescendos. During a particularly challenging run, Victor noticed a young woman in the 10th row. Unlike those around her, she wasn't watching his hands or his face. Instead, her eyes were closed, her head tilted slightly as if she was listening more deeply than anyone else. Something about her concentration irritated him. She wasn't even looking at his technical mastery. At intermission, Victor returned to his dressing room, waving away Thomas's offer of water. "Who is that woman in the 10th row center section? Dark hair, simple blue dress?" Thomas blinked in surprise. Victor never noticed audience members. I don't know, sir. Would you like me to find out?" "No," Victor said dismissively. "It doesn't matter." But for some reason it did matter. As he prepared for the second half of his concert, the demanding Rachmaninoff pieces, Victor couldn't shake the image of the woman with her eyes closed. Was she not impressed by his playing? Did she think she could do better? A strange idea began to form in Victor's mind. Something he had never done before, something no pianist of his stature would consider. It was impulsive, unprofessional even, but suddenly he was certain he would do it. When he returned to the stage after intermission, the audience welcomed him back with enthusiastic applause. Instead of immediately sitting at the piano, Victor stepped to the front of the stage and raised his hand for silence. The unusual gesture caused a ripple of surprise. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "Tonight I would like to try something different," the audience murmured. Victor Petrov never deviated from the printed program. "Music is not just for professional musicians," he continued, surprising even himself with these words. "It belongs to everyone who loves it. Sometimes we professionals forget that. We become isolated in our expertise." In the 5th row, Professor Liu raised an eyebrow. "For the next piece, I would like to invite someone from the audience to play." Gasps and whispers filled the hall. The stage manager looked panicked, peeking out from behind the curtain. This was not planned. This was not Victor Petrov. "Don't worry," Victor said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I will still play the Rachmaninoff as promised. Consider this a small interlude." His eyes searched the crowd until they found the woman in the blue dress still sitting with that same attentive posture. "You," he said, pointing directly at her. "Would you honor us with a piece?" The spotlight swung wildly until it found her. The woman looked startled, her eyes wide with surprise. People around her turned to stare. She shook her head slightly, but Victor persisted. "Please," he said, though it sounded more like a command than a request. "Just a simple piece. Whatever you feel comfortable playing." Thomas appeared at the edge of the stage, looking horrified. The concert hall director was hurrying down the aisle, unsure whether to stop this unexpected turn of events. But Victor stood firm, hand extended toward the woman, a challenging smile on his face. He was curious to see what would happen next. Would she embarrass herself? Would she refuse? Either way, when he returned to play his Rachmaninoff, the audience would appreciate his artistry even more. Little did Victor know that his impulsive invitation was about to change everything. I've written the first part of the story, focusing on establishing Victor Petrov's character as an arrogant but talented pianist and setting up the pivotal moment when he invites the woman from the audience to play. The narrative uses simple language while building an engaging atmosphere. The story introduces the prestigious concert setting at Lincoln Center, Victor's demanding personality and perfectionism, the unexpected impulse to invite an audience member to play, the tension as the woman in the blue dress is put on the spot. Would you like me to make any adjustments to this first part before moving on to part 2? I'll write part 2 of the story following your guidelines. Hush fell over the concert hall as Alexander Romano walked back onto the stage after intermission. The audience had just spent 15 minutes discussing his brilliant performance in the first half. Some people stood in small groups near the refreshment area, debating which piece showed off his talent best. Others returned to their seats early, not wanting to miss a second of what was to come. Alexander adjusted his suit jacket as he approached the microphone stand that had been placed at the front of the stage. This was unusual. Typically, he would simply sit at the piano and begin playing. The audience stirred with curiosity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander said, his voice smooth and confident, "I hope you enjoyed the first part of our evening together." Applause erupted immediately. Alexander raised his hand with a smile, waiting for silence to return. "For the second half, I thought we might try something a little different." In the wings of the stage, the concert manager frowned. This wasn't in the program. The technical crew exchanged confused glances. Alexander Romano was known for being a stickler for plans and schedules. Spontaneity was not in his character. "Music is meant to be shared," Alexander continued, though his eyes held a glint that didn't match his warm words. "And while I have dedicated my life to mastering this instrument, I believe that everyone has a connection to music in their own way." He paused, surveying the audience like a hawk looking for prey. "Tonight, I would like to invite one of you to join me on stage and play something on this magnificent piano." Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. This was unheard of at a professional classical concert. In the third row, an older woman clutched her pearl necklace in shock. Near the back, a music student's mouth fell open. Behind the curtain, Alexander's personal assistant David whispered urgently to the stage manager, "What is he doing? This isn't part of the program." The stage manager shook his head helplessly. "I have no idea. We can't exactly drag him off stage." Alexander was still speaking. "Don't worry, I'm not expecting a professional performance. Just a simple melody. Perhaps Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star?" He chuckled, and some in the audience laughed nervously with him. His eyes scanned the seats row by row. People began to shrink in their chairs, avoiding eye contact. No one wanted to be selected, to be compared to a master on his own stage. "I see many of you are shy," Alexander said with a smirk. "But surely someone here plays a little piano, even as a hobby?" In the 10th row center section sat a woman in her mid-30s. She wore a simple dark blue dress, nothing flashy. Her hair was pulled back in a practical style. Unlike those around her, she wasn't trying to disappear into her seat. She simply watched Alexander with a calm, steady gaze. Alexander noticed her immediately. There was something about her composure that caught his attention and irritated him slightly. While others cowered, she seemed unimpressed. "You," he said suddenly, pointing directly at her. "The lady in the blue dress. Would you honor us with your playing?" A spotlight swung wildly until it found her. People turned in their seats to look. The woman seemed surprised but not panicked. She glanced to her left and right as if to confirm he was indeed pointing at her. "Yes, you," Alexander said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't be shy. We're all friends here." In the wings, David groaned. "Oh God, he's going to humiliate some poor audience member." The stage manager nodded grimly. "This is going to be a disaster." The woman in blue hesitated for just a moment, then slowly stood up. People in her row shifted to let her pass. As she made her way to the aisle, Alexander spoke again. "What's your name, dear?" She paused at the end of her row. "May," she answered, her voice clear but not loud. "May," Alexander repeated. "A lovely name. And do you play the piano, May?" She nodded once. "A little." This was exactly what Alexander wanted to hear. Someone who played a little would be perfect for his plan. He would let her fumble through a simple tune. The audience would appreciate her bravery, but be reminded of the vast gulf between amateur and professional, and then he would return to dazzle them even more with his own playing. "Wonderful," he exclaimed. "Please come join me on stage." As May made her way down the aisle, Alexander turned to the audience with an exaggerated wink. "This is what I love about music. It brings us together, regardless of skill level." Some people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. They were beginning to sense that something wasn't quite right about this interaction. An usher guided May to the steps at the side of the stage. As she climbed them, Alexander gestured grandly toward the magnificent grand piano that stood center stage. "My humble instrument awaits you," he said, his voice dripping with false generosity. The concert hall was completely silent now. Hundreds of eyes followed May as she walked across the stage with measured steps. She didn't rush, but she didn't dawdle either. Her posture was straight, her expression composed. Alexander watched her approach, already imagining how this would play out. He had seen many amateur pianists before, the nervous fumbling, the missed notes, the rigid posture. This would be no different. "Have you been playing long?" he asked as she reached the piano. "On and off," May replied simply. Alexander smiled widely for the audience's benefit. "On and off. Well, that's more than many can say. Do you have a favorite piece you'd like to play for us? Something simple, perhaps?" There was just enough emphasis on the word simple to make his expectations clear. He was setting her up to stay within safe elementary boundaries. May looked at the piano for a moment, then back at Alexander. "I'll think of something," she said. Behind the curtain, the backstage crew watched with a mixture of horror and fascination. The concert manager was on his phone, desperately texting the director of the concert hall. The sound technicians exchanged worried glances. "He's never done anything like this before," whispered one stagehand to another. "What's gotten into him?" "Ego," replied the other. "Pure ego." Alexander gestured toward the piano bench. "Please make yourself comfortable. The piano is perfectly tuned, though I doubt you'll notice the difference." He laughed as if he'd made a joke, but the audience's response was tepid. May adjusted the bench slightly and sat down. She took a moment to position herself, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Alexander stepped back, but not too far. He wanted to remain in the audience's view, ready to step in when this experiment had run its course. He had already planned his gracious response. "Thank you for being such a good sport. Now let me show you what this piano is truly capable of. Would you like me to play anything in particular?" May asked, looking up at him. Alexander waved his hand dismissively. "Whatever you feel comfortable with. Mary Had a Little Lamb, perhaps? Or Chopsticks?" He smiled broadly at the audience, inviting them to share in his joke. A few people laughed, but many more looked uncomfortable. In the fifth row, an elderly man with a stern expression shook his head slightly. May nodded, then turned her attention to the keyboard. She adjusted her position once more, rolling her shoulders gently and placing her hands above the keys. Her fingers hovered there for a moment as if she was deciding what to play. Alexander crossed his arms, waiting. His plan was working perfectly. The longer she hesitated, the more the tension built, and the more dramatic his return would be. In the audience, people leaned forward in their seats. Some felt sorry for May, thinking she was about to embarrass herself. Others were annoyed at Alexander for putting her in this position. A few wondered if this was some planned stunt. Behind the stage, David turned to the stage manager. "Should we do something? Cut the lights? Play recorded music?" The stage manager shook his head. "Too late now. Let's just hope she plays something quick and gets off stage with her dignity intact." May took a deep breath, closed her eyes briefly, and then looked at the keys. She placed her fingers in position. Alexander watched with a satisfied smirk, ready for the simple melody he expected. But in that moment, just before May began to play, something changed in her demeanor. Her shoulders relaxed, her back straightened even more, and her fingers spread with confident precision over the keys. Alexander's smirk faltered slightly. Something wasn't right. This didn't look like the posture of someone about to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. May looked up once more, meeting Alexander's eyes directly. There was something in her gaze. Not nervousness, not fear, but something else entirely. Something he couldn't quite identify. And then she looked away from him, focusing entirely on the piano. The concert hall held its collective breath. No one, least of all Alexander Romano, was prepared for what happened next. I've written part 2 of the story, focusing on Alexander Romano's arrogant challenge and how he selects May from the audience. The narrative builds tension as he sets her up for what he expects to be an embarrassing performance, creating a cliffhanger ending that leads perfectly into part 3. The story uses simple language while maintaining an engaging narrative flow. I've avoided the specific names you mentioned and kept the tone natural and human-centered throughout. Would you like me to make any adjustments to this second part before moving on to part 3? I'll create part 3 of the story following your guidelines. The moment May's fingers touched the keys, the entire concert hall transformed. What came from the piano wasn't the simple melody Alexander had expected. No Twinkle, Twinkle or Mary Had a Little Lamb. Instead, the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor filled the air. one of the most technically challenging pieces in piano literature. Alexander's smug smile vanished instantly. His eyes widened and he took an involuntary step backward. This wasn't possible. May played with absolute confidence, her fingers flying across the keys with practiced precision. The powerful opening gave way to the delicate, haunting melody that followed. Her body swayed slightly with the music, completely in tune with the emotional landscape of the piece. In the audience, people who had been shifting uncomfortably in their seats now sat frozen in shock. The elderly man in the fifth row slowly removed his glasses as if not believing what he was seeing. A young music student in the balcony leaned so far forward he nearly fell out of his seat. Behind the curtain, the stage crew stopped their frantic texting and phone calls. The stage manager's mouth hung open. David, Alexander's assistant, whispered, "Who is she?" Alexander couldn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, watching May's hands move across the keyboard with a fluidity and grace that matched, no, possibly exceeded, his own. Her touch was perfect, her timing impeccable. Every note rang clear and true in the perfect acoustics of the hall. As the piece progressed, becoming more complex and demanding, May showed no signs of struggle. Where most pianists would tense up, she remained relaxed, letting the music flow through her rather than forcing it. The difficult runs that made students despair were, in her hands, effortless cascades of sound. Alexander felt his face grow hot. This was not how his joke was supposed to end. He glanced at the audience and saw their expressions changing from shock to delight. They were being treated to an unexpected masterclass, and they knew it. In the third row, a woman who had been clutching her pearl necklace now had tears streaming down her face. Near the back, a couple held hands tightly, eyes closed as they let the music wash over them. Alexander had a sudden urge to step forward, to interrupt, to reclaim his stage. But he couldn't. The music held him prisoner just as surely as it held the audience, and deep within himself, in a place he rarely acknowledged, he recognized true artistry when he heard it. The piece built to its technically demanding conclusion, with its famously difficult coda that had humbled many professional pianists. May attacked it with controlled passion, her fingers a blur over the keys. The final chords resonated through the hall with thunderous power, then silence. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. No one breathed, then the audience erupted. People leaped to their feet, applauding wildly, some shouting, "Bravo!" Others simply stood with their hands pressed to their mouths in amazement. The standing ovation was immediate and universal. Alexander stood paralyzed, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The spotlight that should have been his now shone brilliantly on May, who sat quietly at the piano, hands folded in her lap. She didn't jump up for exaggerated bows as he might have done. She simply acknowledged the applause with a gentle nod. The concert manager rushed onto the stage, followed closely by David. They seemed unsure of what to do in this unprecedented situation. Alexander barely noticed them. His eyes were fixed on May. When the applause finally began to die down, May stood and turned toward Alexander. There was no triumph in her eyes, no gloating, just a quiet dignity. She gave him a small, respectful bow and began to walk toward the side of the stage. Something in Alexander snapped. He couldn't let her leave like this. He stepped forward quickly, intercepting her before she could exit. "Wait," he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Please wait." May paused, looking at him with those same calm eyes that had caught his attention in the audience. The hall grew quiet again. Everyone sensed that something important was happening. Alexander struggled to find the right words. Pride warred with admiration in his chest. After a moment, he did something he rarely did. He told the truth. That was, he began, his voice unsteady. That was extraordinary. He turned to face the audience, who watched this unexpected drama unfold with rapt attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice stronger now, "I believe we have been graced with the presence of a truly remarkable talent tonight." A fresh wave of applause washed through the hall. Alexander waited for it to subside before continuing. "I must confess something to you all," he said, feeling strangely liberated by the words. "When I invited this lady to play, I did not expect this. I thought—" He hesitated, then pushed on. "I thought it would be amusing. A brief interlude before I returned to dazzle you with my own playing." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people looked uncomfortable, others nodded in understanding. "Instead," Alexander continued, "I find myself humbled, and reminded of why I fell in love with music in the first place. He turned back to May, who had been watching him carefully. Would you? He had to clear his throat before continuing. Would you do me the honor of telling us your name? Your full name? And perhaps a little about yourself? May looked at him for a long moment as if deciding whether his interest was genuine. Then she stepped toward the microphone. My name is May Lin, she said simply. Her voice was clear and carried easily through the hall. I studied at the Beijing Conservatory of Music many years ago. The audience listened in complete silence, hungry for the story behind the unexpected performance they had just witnessed. Due to family circumstances, I had to leave my studies before completing my degree, May continued. I came to this country 15 years ago and now teach piano to children in a community music school across town. Alexander blinked in surprise. A piano teacher at a community school? Playing at this level? When I'm not teaching, May added, I play for patients at the city hospital. Music has healing properties that medicine sometimes cannot provide. The elderly man in the fifth row nodded vigorously at this. Alexander found himself suddenly curious about everything about her. And what brought you to my concert tonight? He asked. May smiled slightly. I brought 5 of my students. They're sitting up there. She pointed to the balcony where a small group of young people waved excitedly. They've been working on pieces by the composers you're playing tonight. I wanted them to hear these works performed by a professional. Alexander felt a strange mixture of emotions: embarrassment at his earlier arrogance, admiration for her talent, and an unexpected respect for her dedication to her students. The audience was completely captivated by this unscripted exchange. What had begun as a potential moment of humiliation had transformed into something authentic and moving. Well, Alexander said, finding himself at a loss for words, a rare occurrence. I believe your students have had the privilege of hearing these works performed by 2 professionals tonight. This earned another round of enthusiastic applause from the audience. Alexander made a split-second decision. Would you, he began, then started again. Would you consider playing another piece? Perhaps. Together? Whispers raced through the concert hall. Alexander Romano never played duets. He was famous for refusing all collaboration offers, claiming that other pianists couldn't match his interpretation or technique. May looked genuinely surprised. A duet? Yes, Alexander said, warming to the idea. There's a second piano backstage. It would take just a moment to bring it out. He turned to the stage manager, who was still standing in the wings, looking stunned. Isn't that right? The stage manager nodded quickly and disappeared behind the curtain, gesturing frantically to the stagehands. What do you say? Alexander asked, turning back to May. Rachmaninoff, perhaps? His suite number 2 for 2 pianos? It was a challenging choice, a piece that required perfect synchronization between the pianists, with each part equally demanding. May considered for a moment, then nodded. I know the piece well. The audience burst into applause again. They were witnessing something unprecedented, not just the discovery of an unexpected talent, but a transformation happening before their eyes. As stagehands wheeled out the second grand piano and positioned it facing the first, Alexander felt a strange lightness. For the first time in many years, he wasn't thinking about his reputation or his ego. He was thinking about the music itself and the unexpected joy of finding someone who loved it as purely as he once had. The stage was set. 2 magnificent pianos faced each other like black mirrored lakes. Alexander and May took their places, adjusting their benches, exchanging a glance that contained both challenge and respect. The audience held its collective breath. What happened next would be talked about in musical circles for years to come. I've written part 3 of the story, focusing on the dramatic moment when May reveals her extraordinary talent and Alexander's humbling reaction. The narrative builds toward their decision to perform a duet together, setting up anticipation for part 4. The story maintains a natural human-centered tone, while using simple language that's engaging and emotional. I've continued with the characters established in part 2, and created a satisfying turning point in the narrative arc. Would you like me to make any adjustments to this third part before moving on to part 4? I'll create part 4 of the story following your guidelines. Asked a woman to play as a joke, part 4. The hall grew silent as Alexander and May positioned themselves at their respective pianos. The stage crew had worked quickly to set up the second instrument, positioning the two grand pianos so that the pianists faced each other across the curved sides, like two halves of a musical heart. Alexander felt a strange nervousness he hadn't experienced in years. Usually he approached performances with absolute confidence, sometimes even boredom. Tonight was different. He was about to play with someone whose talent matched, perhaps even surpassed his own. Someone he had intended to humiliate just minutes ago. The stage lights felt hotter than before. He could feel hundreds of eyes watching, sense the anticipation building in the room. This wasn't what anyone had expected when they purchased tickets to his concert, least of all himself. May sat calmly at her piano, hands resting lightly on her lap. Her posture was perfect but not rigid. There was an ease about her that Alexander had lost somewhere along his journey to fame. Their eyes met across the pianos. In that moment, without words, they established a connection. A slight nod from May, an answering nod from Alexander. They were ready. Alexander raised his hands over the keys and May mirrored his movement. Together they began the first powerful chords of Rachmaninoff's Suite No. 2 for two pianos. The sound was magnificent. Two world-class pianists on two perfectly tuned concert grands, playing music written specifically for this arrangement. The notes filled every corner of the hall, rich and resonant, washing over the audience in waves. From the first measure, Alexander knew this would be unlike any performance he had ever given. Playing with May wasn't like playing with the occasional orchestras he'd performed with, where he always saw himself as the star and them as mere accompaniment. This was a true duet, a conversation, a dance, a perfect balance of give and take. When Alexander's part took the melody, May supported him with harmonies that enhanced rather than competed. When it was her turn to lead, he found himself naturally falling into the supporting role, something he would have resisted fiercely with any other pianist. In the second movement, with its playful, dancing rhythm, Alexander caught himself smiling. Actually smiling. Not the practiced stage smile he used for audiences, but a genuine expression of joy. Across from him, May's face showed the same delight, her eyes bright as they exchanged musical phrases like old friends sharing jokes. The audience watched in amazement. Those who knew Alexander's reputation for coldness and technical precision couldn't believe the transformation before their eyes. His playing had always been perfect, but sometimes mechanical. Tonight there was warmth and life in every note. In the third row, the woman with the pearl necklace whispered to her husband, "It's like he's a different person." Her husband nodded. It's the music. Real music, not just showing off. On stage, Alexander and May reached the third movement, the famous romance. The sweeping, emotional melody soared between the two pianos, one taking it up where the other left off in perfect synchronization. For Alexander, something extraordinary was happening. The walls he had built around himself over years of competition and critical acclaim were crumbling. He wasn't thinking about technique or audience impression or what the reviewers would write. He was simply playing, feeling the music as he had when he was a child, before music became his identity, his profession, his prison. A glance at May showed him she was fully immersed in the piece as well, eyes sometimes closed, body swaying slightly with the rhythm. But whenever a crucial moment of coordination approached, her eyes would open, find his, and communicate everything needed in that single look. In the balcony, May's students watched with wide eyes and open mouths. Their teacher, whom they knew as kind and talented, was playing on equal footing with one of the world's most celebrated pianists. The youngest, a 10-year-old boy, whispered to his friend, "That's why she always tells us to play from our hearts, not just our hands." The final movement arrived, the exhilarating tarantella with its lightning-fast passages and thunderous climaxes. Here, both pianists unleashed their full technical prowess. Their hands became blurs over the keys, producing cascades of notes that seemed impossible for human fingers to achieve. Yet even in this display of virtuosity, there was never competition between them. They matched each other perfectly, neither trying to outshine the other. It was collaboration in its purest form. Behind the stage, the concert staff stood mesmerized. David, Alexander's assistant, had never seen his boss play like this, not just with technical brilliance, but with heart. The stage manager, who had worked hundreds of concerts in this hall, whispered, "I've never heard anything like it." As they approached the finale, The energy between Alexander and May intensified. They pushed and pulled the tempo slightly, following each other's lead instinctively. The dynamic swelled from piano to fortissimo as they built toward the climactic ending. In the final measures, their eyes locked across the pianos. Alexander felt something he couldn't name. A connection beyond words, beyond music even. In that moment, they weren't famous pianist and unknown teacher. They were simply two artists creating something beautiful together. The final chords rang out, powerful and perfect, hanging in the air for a breathless moment before fading to silence. For 3 seconds, the concert hall was completely still. It seemed as if the entire audience was holding its breath, reluctant to break the spell that had been cast over them. Then the silence exploded into the most thunderous applause Alexander had ever heard. People were not just clapping but shouting, stamping their feet, some even crying openly. It wasn't just appreciation for technical skill. It was the kind of response that comes when people have been deeply moved, when art has touched something essential in them. Alexander and May rose from their benches simultaneously. For a moment they stood facing each other across the pianos, a world of understanding passing between them without a word being spoken. Then Alexander did something unprecedented. He walked around the pianos, took May's hand, and led her to the front of the stage. Instead of positioning himself in the center as he always did, he stood beside her as an equal. Together, they bowed to the still roaring audience. The applause continued, showing no signs of diminishing. People who had been seated at the beginning of the evening were now standing on their feet, handkerchiefs dabbing at eyes, hands red from clapping. The elderly man in the 5th row, who Alexander now recognized as Professor Chen, one of his harshest critics, was applauding with more enthusiasm than anyone had ever seen from him. In the balcony, May's students were jumping up and down, their young faces shining with pride. After the 3rd bow, Alexander leaned toward May and whispered, "Thank you." She looked at him with those calm, knowing eyes. "For what?" "For reminding me why I became a pianist in the first place." May smiled, a gentle expression that held no judgment. "Music first, musician second. That's what my first teacher always told me." Those simple words struck Alexander like a revelation. How long had it been since he had put the music before himself? How many years had he spent focusing on his reputation, his technique, his superiority, rather than the pure joy of the music itself? As they took one final bow and the stage lights began to dim, Alexander knew with absolute certainty that something had changed forever. Not just for tonight, not just for this performance, but for everything that would come after. The concert manager approached them as they stepped back from the edge of the stage, his face a mixture of confusion and delight. "That was unexpected," he said, "but extraordinary. Truly extraordinary." Alexander nodded, still holding May's hand. "It certainly was." "The press will want to speak with both of you," the manager continued. "They're already gathering in the green room, and there's a line forming at the stage door." For the first time in his career, Alexander wasn't interested in the press or the fans waiting for autographs. He turned to May. "Your students must be very proud tonight." "They're good kids," she said, "working hard to find their own voice in music." "I'd like to meet them," Alexander said, surprising himself with the sincerity of his request. "And I'd like to talk more about music, about teaching." He hesitated, then added, "If you're willing." Before May could answer, the stage door burst open and a flood of people entered, press with cameras and microphones, concert officials, admirers with programs to be signed. The peaceful moment between the two pianists was shattered by the chaos of fame. As they were surrounded, separated by the crowd, Alexander caught May's eye one last time across the sea of people. In that look was a promise, a question, and the beginning of something entirely new. I've written part 4 of the story, focusing on the transformative duet performance between Alexander and May. The narrative explores how their musical collaboration affects both performers, particularly Alexander's emotional journey as he rediscovers his love for music beyond ego and competition. The story maintains a natural, engaging flow while using accessible language. I've continued building the relationship between the characters and set up for the conclusion in part 5, where we'll see the aftermath of this unexpected musical partnership. Would you like me to make any adjustments to this 4th part before moving on to the final section? I'll create the final part of the story now. Asked a woman to play as a joke. Part 5. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable night at Symphony Hall. The musical world was still buzzing about it. Videos of the impromptu duet had spread across the internet, gaining millions of views. Music magazines featured the story on their covers. People who had never been interested in classical piano were suddenly downloading Rachmaninoff. It was a cold winter morning when Alexander Romano stepped out of his car in front of a modest brick building on the outskirts of the city. A small sign above the door read Community Music Center. He paused for a moment, adjusting his scarf against the chill, then walked inside. The center was nothing like the grand concert halls he was accustomed to. The walls were painted in cheerful colors, decorated with children's artwork. Practice rooms lined the hallway, and from behind closed doors came the sounds of scales, simple melodies, and occasionally frustrated groans. Alexander smiled to himself. These were the real sounds of music learning, not the polished performances people paid hundreds of dollars to hear, but the messy, beautiful process of discovery. He followed the familiar path to room 7 at the end of the hall. The door was open, and inside Mei-Lin sat at an upright piano that had clearly seen better days. Across from her on a small chair sat a young girl, maybe 8 years old, watching intently as May demonstrated a passage from a Clementi sonatina. Alexander waited quietly, not wanting to interrupt. May's teaching style fascinated him. She was patient but not indulgent, kind but not overly praising. Most importantly, she focused on helping the child find joy in the music, not just technical correctness. When the lesson ended, the little girl packed up her music sheets, gave May a quick hug, and dashed out, offering Alexander a shy smile as she passed. "Your 10 o'clock is early," May said, looking up at Alexander with warm eyes. "The traffic was lighter than I expected," he replied, walking into the room. "How was your morning so far?" 3 lessons down, 4 to go. Lisa is making good progress with her Clementi. Alexander sat on the chair the little girl had just vacated. "You have a gift for teaching. These children don't realize how lucky they are to learn from someone like you." May shook her head slightly. "They're the gift. Watching them discover music for the first time, there's nothing quite like it." This was what had drawn Alexander back to May after their performance. Not just her extraordinary talent, but her perspective on music. She saw it as something to be shared, not possessed. Something that gained value when given away, not hoarded for personal glory. "Ready for our session?" she asked, shifting on the piano bench to make room for him. Alexander nodded and joined her. For the past few months, they had been meeting like this once a week. Not for performances or recordings, but for what Alexander had come to think of as musical conversations. Sometimes they played duets. Other times they took turns interpreting the same piece in different ways. Occasionally they simply talked about music, its history, its power, its purpose. Through it all, Alexander found himself changing, returning to the purity of passion that had started him on this path as a child. Today, they were working on a new piece, a duet arrangement of a folk melody that May had grown up with in her childhood village. It was technically simple compared to the classical masterworks Alexander usually played, but it held an emotional depth that challenged him in different ways. "Let's try it again," May suggested. "But this time, don't think about the notes. Think about what the melody is saying." Alexander nodded. This was the most valuable lesson May had taught him, that technical perfection was meaningless without emotional truth. He had been playing all the right notes for years, but somehow missing the music. They began to play, the simple melody flowing between them. There was no audience today except each other, no critics to impress, no reputation to uphold. Just 2 people speaking to each other through music. As they played the final notes, Alexander felt that now familiar sense of peace that came from playing purely for the joy of it. "I still can't believe I almost missed this," he said quietly. "Missed what?" May asked. "This, the real reason for music. For all those years I was so focused on being the best that I forgot to simply be good. Good in the sense that matters," May smiled. "Better late than never." They were interrupted by a knock on the door. David, still Alexander's assistant despite the many changes in his employer's life, stood in the doorway with an apologetic expression. "Sorry to interrupt, but the director of the foundation is on the phone. He says it's important." Alexander sighed. "Tell him I'll call back in 20 minutes." David nodded and retreated. Since the night of the duet with May, Alexander had established a foundation to support music education in underserved communities. It was demanding work, especially alongside his continued concert schedule, but it had given his career a purpose beyond personal acclaim. "You should take the call," May said. "We've covered good ground today." Alexander shook his head. "The foundation can wait." "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." May looked at him with curious eyes. In the months since their first meeting, they had developed a friendship built on mutual respect and shared passion. They had performed together several more times, always to sold-out crowds, but these quiet sessions at the community center had become more important to Alexander than any concert hall appearance. "I'm planning my world tour for next year," he began. 20 cities, major venues," May nodded. She knew about the tour. It had been in the news for weeks. "I'd like you to come with me," Alexander continued. "Not as an opening act or a special guest, but as an equal partner. A true duet tour." Surprise flashed across May's face. "Alexander, I'm not sure that's—" "Before you say no," he interrupted, "I know what you're thinking. You have your students, your community work, but we could incorporate master classes in each city. Work with local music programs. Make it more than just performances." May was silent for a moment, considering. "Why?" she finally asked. "You don't need me for your tour to be successful. Your name alone sells out venues." Alexander looked down at the piano keys, running his fingers lightly over them without pressing down. "6 months ago, I would have agreed with you. My name, my reputation, my technique, that seemed like enough. But now I know better." He looked up at her. "That night, when you played Chopin after I tried to humiliate you, you could have shown me up, made me look foolish. Instead, you showed me grace. And when we played together, you showed me what music can be when it's not about ego or competition." May's expression softened. "You showed yourself. I just happened to be there." "No." Alexander shook his head firmly. "It was you. Your playing, your approach to music, your wholeness as an artist. I've performed with many people since then, trying to recapture what happened that night. It's never the same." The truth was, Alexander had changed profoundly since that concert. Critics had noticed it in his playing, a new depth, a vulnerability that had been missing before. His audiences had grown, not decreased, as he showed more of his authentic self through his music. But something was still missing when he played alone. "We make each other better," he said simply, "not just technically, but as musicians. As people who speak through music." May looked thoughtful. "My students will be here when you return. And think of how much you'll bring back to them. New experiences, new perspectives." Alexander smiled. "Besides, several of them have already threatened to chain themselves to my car if I don't convince you to join the tour. Especially that young boy with the glasses." That made May laugh. "Lee, he's quite determined." "Smart kid," Alexander said. "He recognizes an extraordinary teacher when he sees one." May turned to look out the window of the small practice room. Beyond the parking lot was the neighborhood where most of her students lived. Modest homes, hard-working families, children with dreams bigger than their circumstances. "What happened that night at Symphony Hall," she said slowly, "wasn't just about music, was it?" Alexander shook his head. "No. It was about what can happen when we drop our walls, when we stop performing and start communicating, when we remember why we fell in love with music in the first place." May turned back to him. "And the tour would be like that? Not just virtuoso performances, but something meaningful?" "That's what I'm hoping," Alexander said. "But I can't do it alone. I tried that path for too many years." Outside the practice room, the sounds of the community center continued. A young violinist struggling with a difficult passage, a piano student practicing scales, a cello making its deep, resonant tones. This was the foundation of music. Not the spotlights and standing ovations, but the daily work of learning, failing, trying again. May listened to these sounds for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll need to arrange coverage for my students, and I want to be involved in planning the community engagement activities." Alexander felt a surge of joy that surprised him with its intensity. "Of course. Equal partners, remember?" "Equal partners," May agreed with a smile. "Though I still can't believe this all started because you wanted to embarrass an audience member for your own amusement." Alexander winced. "Not my finest moment." "And yet," May said, "it led to something neither of us expected." "Sometimes the wrong note leads to the right path," Alexander laughed at the musical metaphor. "I'm just glad you were the wrong note I chose that night." As they turned back to the piano to continue their practice, Alexander felt a deep sense of gratitude. His life had been filled with accolades and achievements, but never with the genuine fulfillment he had found since that fateful night. What had begun as a cruel joke had become the most authentic thing in his life. Sometimes, the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. I've written the final part of the story, bringing Alexander and May's journey to a meaningful conclusion. This part shows the lasting impact of their unexpected performance 6 months later, with Alexander having undergone significant personal growth, and both characters developing a partnership based on mutual respect. The story concludes with Alexander inviting May to join his world tour as an equal partner, highlighting how their musical connection has transformed his approach to music and his career. The narrative maintains a natural, engaging tone throughout while using accessible language. The ending provides closure to the story arc while emphasizing the theme that sometimes the most meaningful connections and personal growth come from unexpected places. Is there anything specific you'd like me to adjust in this final part?